All right, well, thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to echo the other speakers in thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to be able to talk about some of our work today and some of the thoughts that I've had about a Canadian diet. So I do have some disclosures. A lot of our work on the Pure Prairie Eating Plan and our related research and interventions has been supported by the agriculture industry in Alberta and Canada. And the logos of those supporters is depicted here. I will say that the sale of our book, which was co-authored with Dr. Rhonda Bell, who many of you know, because of the support of all of these people listed, or organizations listed on the slide, all of the profits from the book have been turned back into research by our group. And I do have one copy of the book if there's people who haven't seen it and would like to have a look at it. And I was actually thinking we could have a raffle. If you put your email address on your word cloud pieces of paper, then Ashley can collect them and I'll give her the book, and then she can draw a name and somebody can win it. Because I really don't want to take this to Europe with me. Okay, so we're going to have a raffle. Excellent. So in my talk today, what I want to address is some of the forces that determine what we eat, and I think actually Isabel has dealt with many of that, so I'm going to just briefly talk about things from maybe a little bit different perspective. I'll talk a little bit about our research, which was called the PANDA project, and then end up with some thinking about what a Canadian diet might look like. So when we think about the forces that determine what we eat, I think we tend to think about mainly the personal forces. So this is a guy that I've decided to call Kelvin. And when Kelvin is thinking about what he's going to eat for lunch, some of the influences on that are, as Isabel has described. So the influence of family and friends, I maybe should have put that a little bit higher. Taste preferences, clearly very important to consumers. Nutrition knowledge, that wasn't a term that Isabel used, but I think it was embedded in some of the questions that were asked of people. And then the time that people have to shop, to purchase food, and their cooking skills, abilities, and so on. But when Kelvin gets out in the big, wide world, he might find, if he really looked at things, that his actual personal preferences become quite small compared with the environmental influences that determine what we eat. So people have looked at many different kinds of health behaviors from a more ecological perspective. And when we're talking about ecological perspectives, we're taking into account not just those individual knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, but also the bigger world around us and things that influence those health behaviors. So we've mentioned the influence of family and friends, but then there's also the influence of organizations. So let's say your workplace as an organization. There's the influence of community, which is defined as the relationship among organizations. And then there's the big, broad influence of public policy that we have also been addressing in this symposium. So to put some of those concepts into a more concrete perspective, here's Kelvin, and he's at his workplace. And his workplace has a very nice cafeteria with a lot of different food selections in it. And Kelvin says, there's a lot of choice here. What am I going to have for lunch? So he's in line with his pal Joe, and Joe's putting a big pile of fries onto his plate. And so Kelvin says, well, if Joe's having fries, maybe I should have fries too. They look pretty good. At the organizational level, Joe realizes that his workplace is trying to promote healthy eating by providing lots of vegetables, but they still serve French fries. At the community level, and this reflects the city of Edmonton where I live, there are more liquor stores than grocery stores. And the nearest store to me only has snack food and bananas, no fresh vegetables. And then at the public policy level, which Kelvin may not be really aware of at all because it's just out there, the price of food has increased because of diversion of some crops to biofuels production. So now maybe his workplace can't afford to put those foods into the cafeteria menus. So these are the kinds of external factors that influence an individual's food choice that they may not think about as often as they think about the healthy properties of a particular product or whether their family actually likes to eat Brussels sprouts. Then there are some frameworks that have been developed to look specifically at food systems. This is one that was recently published in 2015 by the Institutes of Medicine. And it's a nice framework. I quite like it because it does bring together all of those different aspects of the food environment that influence what an individual might eat, but it's also kind of complicated. But I'll just mention a few things. So it talks about, excuse me, it does talk about the food production side. So over here we've got farm production, we've got farm input supply, we've got manufacturers' activities, we've got wholesalers, retail and food services, and the actual consumer. Then we've got different aspects of society. So the health of a society influences food intake, the overall environment that we live in, social influences, and economic influences as well. What we might not think about, again, in terms of food intake are things like social movements. So now we've got anti-GMO, we've got pro-organic, we've got all of these different ideas about sustainability of the environment that are also impacting on our food supply. We've got things that are totally out of our control, like the weather, and that can influence food price and other market changes. So this is one idea of a framework that we could think about if we were trying to construct a Canadian diet. How would all of these influences impact the sustainability of that Canadian diet concept, not just in an environmental sense, but also the sustainability of people to be able to consume that dietary pattern over a long period of time, and the sustainability in terms of production and all of those other factors. So the point that I'm trying to make is that individual food choices are complex and not just dependent on nutrition knowledge or taste preferences. In our work, we've tried to distill a few things down to a really simple framework that we can get our heads around very easily, as long as we can remember what those 4 A's stand for. So we call it the 4A framework, and we really pulled it out of the food security literature. So what our research team thinks about when we're thinking about dietary patterns is, first of all, are they nutritionally adequate? So adequacy is the first A. Are the foods that are included in this dietary pattern accessible, both from a financial and a geographic standpoint? Are the foods that are included in the dietary pattern available? So are they readily imported? Are they generally found in an ordinary grocery store, not at Planet Organic? And finally, the 4th A is, are these foods acceptable? So acceptability refers to the hedonic properties of foods, such as the taste, the smell, the texture, but it also refers to personal acceptability. So is this something that my family will eat? Is this acceptable within my religious faith? Is this acceptable within my cultural and ethnic background? So all of these 4 things need to come together, if we feel, in order for people to sustain a healthy dietary pattern. So we took the 4A framework and we used it to develop a menu plan, which in the end turned out to be the Pure Prairie Eating Plan, and specifically for people with type 2 diabetes, which is the population of greatest interest in our research group. So we tried to develop something that would embody the 4A framework, that would help to manage diabetes, and would be, over the long term, sustainable for people to eat. Let me just go back and say that PANDA, for those of you who are curious, stands for Physical Activity and Nutrition for Diabetes in Alberta. Okay, so the genesis of some of our thinking, in addition to the 4A framework, was thinking about dietary patterns that were known to be healthful. And the Mediterranean diet was really top of mind. We have a colleague whose name is Eddie Ryan. Some of you may know him. He's a physician, an endocrinologist. He does a lot of work in people who have gestational diabetes. And Eddie said, you know, Alberta is not the Mediterranean. We don't have that beautiful sound of lapping waves and seagulls crying. But surely we could come up with something that would be like the Mediterranean diet, but would be more suitable for Albertans. Because when we think about the Mediterranean diet in the context of Alberta or the context of Canada, for sure we can say that yes, the Mediterranean diet is nutritionally adequate. There are lots of studies out there now that show, for example, less risk of obesity, better outcomes in diabetes, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, possibly even lower risk of dementia. It's a miracle. But in Canada, are the foods that are shown in the Mediterranean diet pyramid really accessible to all Canadians? Some yes, some no. Certainly we have a very diverse food supply system that brings in avocados and eggplants and things that were never in the grocery store when I was a little girl. But they may not be financially accessible. So that eggplant may cost a lot more for the nutritional value that it provides, compared with foods that would be available more locally. Availability, again, an issue. Are these foods always going to be there for the people who are consuming them? And acceptability is a big one as well. So many Canadians don't like the taste of olive oil, even though they might recognize that it has terrific nutritional properties. So all of these things combined suggest to us that just recommending, handing out the Mediterranean diet pyramid the way we hand out Canada's food guide might not be the best method to get people to eat a healthy diet. So we decided that we would create a dietary pattern that would more reflect the values, the preferences, the cultural makeup of Albertans, and use that in our interventions. So our guiding principles, and I would suggest that these could be guiding principles for a broader Canadian diet discussion. The first principle was that healthy foods are abundant on the prairies. We grow lots and lots of foods that are healthy. If we choose local foods that support healthy eating, this will also support a healthy economy. The foods that we emphasize are for everyone at all life stages. So even though we were working with a type 2 diabetes population, if you look at the diabetes guidelines, and the new ones were just published a couple of weeks ago, one of the first recommendations is to get people to follow the recommendations in Canada's food guide. So there's nothing really magical about a diabetes diet. It's what everybody should be eating. The second part of that was that advice that we give should be consistent with Eating Well with Canada's Food Guide. We know that there's emerging evidence all of the time, but we wanted to make sure that the people who participated weren't getting conflicting messages from our programming versus what was considered the standard. And we wanted to meet evidence-based guidelines that would help to reduce risk and/or treat chronic diseases. And as I said, our target population was diabetes, but we recognize that most of the elements of a healthy diabetes diet are also going to be protective against cardiovascular disease, cancer, obesity, and so on. And then the foods that we included, we felt should be grown on the prairies whenever possible, but of course the prairie is a very challenging environment, and we recognize that Canadians like to eat bananas, for example, which are not grown anywhere in Canada. They like to eat tree fruits that are grown in Ontario and British Columbia. They like to drink wine that's grown all around the world. So we had to be realistic about this whole thing. And in the context of the agriculture industry, we thought that having a significant value-added component for processing and/or production could also be helpful to our economy. So I do want to emphasize that what we came up with was not a 100-mile diet, because we didn't really think that something that extreme would be sustainable for the majority of our people over the long term. And just again to emphasize that we did have a lot of support from the agriculture industry in developing our menu plan and our dietary pattern. And it was interesting when we talked to them, because all of them wanted to see what we were up to. How are we going to be portraying their foods? Because almost every agriculture commodity group is under siege from one consumer group or another. So, for example, the canola people have the anti-GMO agitators. Alberta pulse growers and Alberta barley say, well, people won't eat pulses and barley because they're too hard to prepare, they don't know what to do with them. Canada Beef was worried because beef is getting a bad rep. The Wheat Commission, all of the gluten-free crowd was dissing on wheat. Milk makes you fat. What else can we? About the only people, the potato growers, high GI, can't have that if you're diabetic. So all of the different commodity groups were worried that we were going to be portraying their foods in sort of negative light. So we showed them some sample menus and we said, no, this is how we can fit all of your foods into a menu plan that, when you follow Canada's Food Guide, would end up with something being healthy. And so from that perspective, they were willing to come on board. So within the book, there are 28 days of menus, and then there are recipes that go with each of the menus. And this is just from one of our recent intervention programs in a primary care network, where the dietitians prepared some of the foods and brought them to one of the education sessions for the participants to partake of. So I'm just going to show you a few results from our biggest intervention so far. This was a single-arm trial that we ran with about 73 participants, 63 of whom completed, so about an 80% completion rate. And these are the 6-month follow-up outcomes analyzed as intention to treat, for those of you who are interested in those sorts of details. So what we looked at was hemoglobin A1C as the most important variable for type 2 diabetes, so a measure of over time control of blood glucose, and we saw a 0.5% decrease in A1C at 6 months, which is clinically significant and also statistically significant, so this is the 95% confidence intervals. There was a very small decrease in weight of 1.4 kilograms, but it was interesting that the change in A1C did correlate with the weight loss. There was a reduction in waist circumference, there was a reduction in total cholesterol, an elevation in HDL or good cholesterol, a reduction in LDL cholesterol, and no significant difference at 6 months in triglycerides. We analyzed their nutrition using 24-hour recall repeated 3 times, and we found that there was a small reduction in total energy intake of about 178 kilocalories per day. And their macronutrient distributions didn't really change all that much, but we did see a significant reduction in total unsaturated fat, a small reduction in protein. These are expressed in grams per day. Reduction in added sugars, quite a significant reduction in sodium of 570 milligrams. And then we calculated the healthy eating index and found a small upward increase of 2.1 points on the score. And we have another survey that we call the Perceived Dietary Adherence Questionnaire, which is more in tune with the diabetes recommendations, so might be more sensitive to changes in the diet of a person with diabetes, and that also increased by 8.5 points, and the maximum score for that one is 63. We also just recently had an undergraduate student who looked at food acceptability and took some surveys that we had used to measure food acceptability. So we asked questions like, do you enjoy eating the foods that are recommended to you in your diabetes diet? When you shop, do you buy the foods that are recommended for your diabetes diet? When you go out to eat, do you eat foods that are recommended for your diabetes diet, and so on? And we found that this dietary, this so-called food acceptability score correlated inversely with A1C. So in other words, the more acceptable a person found their diet to be, the lower their A1C, and this was maintained even after controlling for age, years with diabetes, waist circumference, and BMI. And interestingly, food acceptability also correlated with dietary adherence score. So that's the research behind some of our work and demonstrating that something like Pure Prayer Eating Plan might be a way to encourage people to eat a more healthy diet. So Jim has already gone through the pre-conference survey that was done, and I've just put up some of the points that came out of the survey, this time interpreting them from more of a 4A framework perspective. So when the survey respondents gave a response, could it be fit into that acceptable, available, accessible, and adequate framework? So the answer is yes, actually. Many of the responses of the survey can be put into the context of the 4A framework. So, for example, foods that are grown locally and are readily available. The idea that we should talk to Canadian agriculture and probably food manufacturers as well. That we should consider cultural practices and preferences in creation of a Canadian diet. And that we should include whole, locally, or minimally processed foods. Again, this idea of cultural preferences, which I'll highlight, and then all of these foods that are mentioned here, pulses, seafood, nuts, etc., they're all included here to a greater or lesser extent, but you have to appreciate that Albertans are not anywhere close to the ocean, and so their idea of eating seafood, generally speaking, is maybe having a bit of salmon or a can of tuna, although the fish that is grows naturally in Alberta, like walleye, is a tremendously delicious fish. It's just not easy to get. Some of the other things that would work with the 4A framework: improving the health of Canadians, that idea of nutritional adequacy, opportunity for agri-food innovation, reducing the cost of food, and improving accessibility. So all compatible with the 4A framework. And then some of these barriers. I thought it was interesting that this paper came out just recently, 2018, talking about an Ontario food and nutrition strategy, which I believe the purpose of is to try and overcome some of these lacks of alignment in the system. And within this paper, the authors described that there were 3 main objectives that they wanted to pursue: healthy food access, food literacy and skills, and healthy food systems, to try and marry all of the different stakeholders together. So I should back up and say that this was a bunch of different stakeholders coming together from the perspective of health, perspective of agriculture, perspective of industry. All of the people who need to be at the table seem to be there. And so this is very encouraging for trying to break down some of those barriers and to create more alignment. But the one sentence in the paper that really struck me was that all of the people who were working on this project were doing it as a side project. So off the side of their desk, in their spare time, they were trying to come up with an Ontario food and nutrition strategy. So it seemed quite sad to me that something as important as this was being done in someone's spare time. So another area or another place where we might look for guidance to develop a Canadian diet for all Canadians would be in the recipe book industry. Of course, recipe books aren't guaranteed to only have healthy recipes in them, but it certainly is a reflection of food trends, what people in Canada might be cooking, what they think might be interesting. And it is great to see that there are books that try to portray Canada's food culture all across the land. And I think it's important to realize that there are probably many food cultures in Canada. There's lots of commonalities, but there's also many regional specializations. This is a travelogue, and so some guy went traveling around and wrote about all of the great food that he ate as he crossed Canada. This one I think is particularly interesting. It's written by a guy who's 90 years old now, named Habib Saloom, who lives on the prairies. He calls it Arab Cooking on a Prairie Homestead. So he was one of the early Muslim immigrants into the prairies who wrote a cookbook to help his people of his culture eat foods that were culturally appropriate in a strange environment. There's cookbooks about fishing, there's cookbooks about Acadian food, there's cookbooks on pretty much anything that you would want to cook, but from a Canadian perspective. So all of that could be helpful. Another place that we can look in constructing a Canadian diet would be other places where national diets exist. So of course there's the Mediterranean diet, but I think it's important to realize that the Mediterranean diet wasn't created to be a healthy diet. It's kind of an accident that it's actually a healthy diet, because it really just depicts the foods that were eaten in the Mediterranean region over a historical time frame. Another thing that's interesting is that other countries have looked to the Mediterranean diet and then said, how can we fit this into our context? So Switzerland has done that a little bit by increasing the emphasis on dairy products, because cheese and other dairy products are very important to the Swiss. And they found that actually a Mediterranean dietary pattern with that increased emphasis on dairy is still health protective. One group that has really created a diet from scratch, if you like, or a dietary pattern from scratch, would be the New Nordic diet in Denmark. And their 3 guiding principles is that more calories should come from plant foods and fewer from meat, that more foods should come from the sea and the lakes, and more food from the wild countryside. And so some of that, I think, does resonate with our current thinking around what Eating Well with Canada's food guide might look like in terms of plant versus animal protein. at least the rumors we hear. But I wonder about more food from the sea and lakes and more foods from the wild countryside, given that most Canadians are from a more urban environment. And then in Canada, of course, we have to think that we are a very diverse country, that not all of us come from a European background, and we need to think more broadly. And we need to remember our 4A framework. And so maybe we can do something like take an established, well-known to be healthy type of dietary pattern like the Mediterranean diet pyramid and superimpose our 4A framework on top of that. And so I just kind of started cutting and pasting the Mediterranean diet pyramid. I think it's great that we can leave this bottom part to reflect mainly plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, plant-based oils. But we might want to replace the picture with foods that are more representative of those that are available in Canada, and replace the olive oil with other heart-healthy oils, such as canola oil and other vegetable oils. But I still think that that bottom layer is a really great foundation, and I think the foundation that that eating together, playing together is also a great message. Then we have seafood, which is highly emphasized in the Mediterranean diet. In my perspective, we might de-emphasize the seafood a little bit or take into account some regional differences. So I've put the seafood on the West Coast, the East Coast, and up in the Arctic. And with less in the middle, and then a balance of poultry, pork, eggs, milk, yogurt, cheese, meat, all in a nice, holistic dietary pattern that would meet nutritional needs and bring in proteins from a variety of different sources. And then I think we need to overlay our Canadian mosaic. We're not just a red and white flag, we're a flag of many colors now from all around the world. And so our dietary pattern might not reflect specific recipes for an entire, for all of Canada, but reflect that we eat very diversely, that we have the luxury of being able to eat many, many different foods from all cultures around the world. Just as an example, as one of our side projects, one of my students constructed a Chinese menu plan for type 2 diabetes. So it was based on what we had already done, but took into account the cultural and other preferences of Chinese people. So we might have to think about how we can do that more broadly for all of the different ethnic groups that inhabit Canada. And then lastly, I think that we have to remember, if we have a goal of getting people closer to their food and recognizing the health benefits and how it can all be combined together, that we don't live in 1960 anymore. This is a photograph of my grandfather's farm about 1960. You can see that there's a big orchard here. He had chickens, he had dairy cattle, he had sheep. All of it was confined on this pretty small acreage, but he could raise pretty much all of the food that he needed for his family at that time. Life has changed in Canada. We have bigger farms. We have large acreages devoted to wheat, for example, canola. I was down in southern Saskatchewan last summer near Grasslands National Park, and I was astounded that all you could see was wheat. How many of you have been in southern Saskatchewan? Like, it's just amazing, isn't it? How you just look out and you cannot see a tree, you cannot see a natural piece of foliage. It is just wheat or canola as far as you can see. It's amazing. We've got fishers There's a lot of industrialization of our fishing industry. And then we've got many food production companies. Many of them are multinational. And I believe that if we are going to create a Canadian diet for all, that we need to engage our food production system very early and very closely and make sure that the foods that we are including in our Canadian diet are truly accessible to all, not just the people who live in a higher level socioeconomic group. We have to remember that 10 to 15% of Canadians are food insecure. We have to take all of these things into account if we're going to create a Canadian diet that is truly sustainable and health promoting for Canadians. So I'll just finish off with my acknowledgements, which none of you can read. All of our participants who have been in our studies over the years, my PANDA teammates, all of the students and staff who have contributed to our research. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Don't forget to fill out your ballot with your email address.
Yes, fill out your ballots. We have time for a couple of questions from the floor.
Thanks very much, Mary Labe, University of Toronto. I actually want to commend you for that because I think you're doing it the right way, looking at the Canadian foods and the Canadian patterns, because when I was talking this morning about doing the pattern analysis, we set out to look at the Mediterranean diet, but the truth be known, it didn't really work because less than 20% of Canadians actually follow the Mediterranean diet. We just don't eat those foods. So when you try to do, you know, all the quintiles when less than 20%, you're talking like 4%, 8%, it just doesn't work. So I think the notions are there, you just need to substitute those foods with the Canadian appropriate foods. And then I'm sure, because we've shown most of those dietary patterns don't work, so I think you're absolutely on the right track. And so I like the way you did, and when you actually started going through and actually doing the Canadian substitutes, because they're the, you know, the sort of the most relevant products. So did you do sort of like an analysis in terms of those, in terms of what that diet would look like nutritionally relative to, say, the Mediterranean diet? And, you know, would it give us the same, I mean, I suspect it would be just as healthy and give us the same kind of nutritional, meet same, you know, whether it's our fibers or, you know, number of fruits and vegetable servings. I think you're substituting the numbers with things, but are they nutritionally semi-equivalent, or you're thinking that?
We didn't compare it directly to the Mediterranean diet, but what we did in the book, each day's menus tell you how many servings from Canada's Food Guide, the amount of fiber, fat, saturated fat, et cetera, and then for each week we also computed it so that we knew that we were at least following Canada's Food Guide, and you know, whole grains are in there, and you know, all of the rest of it.
Okay, so I mean, doing it by week, that's probably even better than doing it by foods, because we don't do it by one, but that mixed blend will actually do. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I am interested to know, in the development of the eating plan, if you somehow involved Indigenous diets in Alberta and how you went about doing that?
We did not, and we recognize that Indigenous peoples and anybody who lives in a remote town in Alberta has a lot less access to fresh vegetables and fruits and so on. But we have, I think it's encouraging that we've actually sold quite a few books to Indigenous communities, not just in Alberta, but in British Columbia as well. And we're currently working with one of our First Nations in Edmonton to work with them to kind of refine this, to make it more theirs, and then to develop an intervention that would be suitable for their communities. So it is an area that we're extremely interested in moving into.
Thank you.
Hi, Benoit Lamarche from Laval University in Quebec. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting perspective. I am thinking about this, and I think we have a challenge in talking about a Canadian diet. We've just finalized a reflection on the Quebec diet, which came up in a book recently, and there are some quite dramatic differences in how people just perceive food and diet and eating actually in the different part of the country, and in Quebec in particular. This is by no means a political statement, but we have different history of how we eat in the country, and just for example, the legume aspect of the healthy diet, this is not part of the Quebec culture at all. We don't grow legumes in Quebec. And we don't actually eat much legumes. It's less than 1% of the protein intake in Quebec. So there's a huge challenge, I think, in talking about a Canadian diet, and we have to, perhaps in the messaging we're going to go through and forward with, we have to take that into account to make sure that people relate to what we're talking about. And this is true for Quebec. I'm sure it's true for the eastern part of Canada as well, and so on. So this is something we perhaps need to keep in mind, and not talk about a Canadian diet, but different.
I totally agree with you. So I've had the privilege of living in British Columbia, where I was born, Alberta, and Prince Edward Island, so coast to coast. I have not had the privilege of living in Quebec, but another of my attributes, I guess, that might be relevant is that I'm, after this meeting, going to Italy, and I teach a course to University of Alberta students about culture and diet and other health behaviors. So I also have a bit of a perspective on the Mediterranean diet. And I totally agree that there's no one Canadian diet, and I think that, like I said, with the new Nordic diet, I'm not even sure that trying to go back, say 300 years to what we used to do, fishing from the stream, is the right way to construct a diet that is sustainable in the 21st century. So in Canada, I think we will have to be very sensitive to Indigenous ways of eating, to our original founding nations' ways of eating, and then to all of those new immigrants who are bringing such delicious, tasty legume recipes to Canada, and many other new ways of eating, and how to distill all that down into something that is really healthful, sustainable. I'm hoping Harvey is going to shed some light on that in the afternoon, because I'm not sure how to do it, but I think it is going to be very important.
Yeah, Peter Jones, University of Manitoba, on the other side of the prairies, and I wish we could have Manitobans consume the kind of diet that's rich in those prairie constituents, but it's always a challenge to actually enact behavior change and make that a reality. My quick question was, the cholesterol numbers you showed for the PANDA study, really impressive, both the increase in HDL and the reduction in total. The issue is, obviously that's not a blinded intervention, and were there other things going on? Did people change their lifestyles, my real question? Did you get a sense of whether physical activity might have increased, or people just behaved themselves in different ways to contribute to that improvement, or was it all diet driven?
Right, so we did monitor physical activity by giving people pedometers at the beginning and at the end. One of the issues was we tend to start our interventions in February and March because we want to take advantage of people's after Christmas desire to improve their health. And so, of course, the weather gets better as the intervention goes on and people are outdoors more and getting more activity. In addition to, of course, when you intervene on one health behavior, you pretty much are going to intervene on other health behaviors. So we did see that physical activity went up. When we did multivariate analysis, we didn't see an impact of physical activity on A1C, but we didn't run a cholesterol analysis. So it's entirely possible that some of that physical activity was contributing there. And maybe they were drinking more red wine, who knows?
Okay, thank you very much, guys.